Tom, we record these and publish these every Thursday morning.
Yep.
And this Thursday night is the last and what was supposed to be the third debate in the presidential debate series for 2020. It turned out to be the second, if you can.
I thought you were going to say this was going to be the third dumpster fire.
Well, it will likely be that too. I mean, considering the moderator and considering how the two town halls went.
I don't think I've heard. Who's the moderator?
It's somebody who worked for one of the campaigns, either the Hillary campaign or worked in the Obama-Biden White House or worked for Biden
isn't
before.
It a curious thing how there's a committee, there's a presidential debate committee. That committee always seems to find moderators who have roots in the Democratic Party or Democratic politics, one way or another.
They all take them from the mainstream media, and it's not like they have a whole lot of options that aren't a part of that group, right? At least it's not Dan Rather. I mean, if we went that way, who knows?
Right.
But as we approach this, I thought it would be an interesting opportunity today to kind of talk about not necessarily what we should expect from an actual experience, right? Not what should we expect the actual debate to be like, but what should we expect as citizens for the debate to be like?
Maybe what we should demand that it be, right? Rather than what these two guys are actually going to deliver.
And I think about it from the standpoint of as we talk about and look back at debates throughout the centuries of this country. We've talked in depth about the debates between Adams and Jefferson even and the arguments. I mean, it wasn't necessarily, they weren't sitting down in public and having this nationally televised debate. After all, how could they in 1800 or 1799? But there has been this evolution of debate, and there's been this evolution. And I think there's some conversation to be had about what should we be listening for on Thursday night's debate? What should we expect? What should stand out to us? And also, what should we what should we demand, or what should we really prefer to hear as opposed to what we do?
Well, and I want to, sort of pick up on a theme that you talk about often, and that is, in general, with rare exceptions, in general, politicians tend to deliver what they know the people want. So anyone who is upset or appalled by these debates, just realize there are a lot of sophisticated people with very sophisticated tools to analyze public opinion, public demand. What do people want?
Right.
What do they value? And that's what these politicians tend to provide. So in a way, I guess you could say we get the debates we want. If the American people wanted something of more substance, something deeper, something more civil, something more respectful, we would get it. These two candidates are delivering what they think the people want to hear or see.
And the candidates do their own research, and the candidates deliver what they think that whether it's their base or the undecided voters. I heard a statistic this morning that still in the United States, they believe that 1 out of every 7 voters is still undecided on who they're going to vote for. And I was actually kind of surprised about that. I thought,
I find that hard to believe.
Well, that's been the most recent polling. Now, I would argue the skew, if that's really the case, the skew is actually going to be more towards more of those people voting for Trump than Biden.
I agree.
Because in most cases, somebody who is not comfortable publicly admitting that they're voting for Trump would likely say, I'm undecided. Yep. They're not going to just say, I'm going to vote for Biden. They're going to say, I'm undecided.
Right.
So somewhere between 1 in 7 and 1 in whatever are still undecided. And the campaigns are out there analyzing this. But so are the networks and so are the moderators, right? And we understand that the moderators are going out and saying, well, what does the public want to hear about? What's going to give us the best ratings? It'll be interesting. We just learned that foreign policy is not going to be a topic in this debate. There's a high likelihood that's in relation to the news coming out about Hunter Biden, the conversations about how are the two different presidents, how is Trump's China policy going to continue? What is Biden's China policy going to be? What is Biden's Eastern European and European policies going to be?
Right.
But the moderators decided that. Now, we go back to this comment at the beginning that a lot of these moderators are are heavily leaning in the side of the Democrats, of the progressives, and there's some conversation going on about what's going to best help our ratings. There's also some conversation about what are the topics we want to talk about that are going to most benefit
our candidate. Yeah. And it's a really interesting question when you dig into it, right? I mean, if you have a bunch of progressive Democrats and you're inside a major TV network and you're making these calculations, I mean, on the one hand, of course you want viewers. You're running a business, so you always want viewers. That's always part of what will attract the most viewers. But it's also a bunch of progressive Democrats. So they have to be thinking,
yes,
how can we arrange this? How can we conduct this debate in a way that will help Biden or hurt Trump or both at the same time? And I've often wondered about those calculations because it's not clear to me that when they are so overtly aggressive and partisan, that actually helps their candidate. I'm trying to think of the moderator's name, the woman's name for the town hall with Trump here recently.
The one just recently is from the Today Show.
Yes, that's her. And I'm terrible with these kind of names.
I can't stand watching the show just because of how partisan it is.
Right.
I do know her husband worked in the Obama-Biden White House, and I do know
of course
her husband now works for the DNC.
Right. And when you watch that kind of, I mean, she was getting after him, and there were a lot of moments where she just seemed hostile and angry. And I wonder how much does that hurt Trump versus how much does it help Trump? How much does that either energize his base to make sure that people say that this is outrageous, this is supposed to be a neutral format so we can just, hear the president, hear the candidate speak? And how much does that go to people who for whatever the number is out there, who still are truly undecided? I would think that would tip them in the direction of supporting Trump rather than, it just looks like such a sham.
It's an interesting question because you wonder how many of the undecideds, if you're undecided at this point, you're probably one of two spectrums. Either you are highly political and you have deep thoughts and have really studied a lot of political science, political ideas, political theory, philosophy, and you are still sort of balancing where you're thinking on that.
And I would suspect for that group, that kind of brainy intellectual group you're describing, probably they're undecided because they're not real crazy about either.
Right.
That would be my guess.
Right. And then you have the other side who, I just don't like politics. I don't want anything to do with this. I don't like either guy. I understand why people say they don't like Biden. I understand why people say they don't like Trump.
Right.
I don't really know what to do. And are they actually paying enough attention to these debates to really figure out the moderator herself or himself is actually leaning towards it, or are they just watching it the same way they watch the news and saying, well, the moderator is supposed to be the independent one. If the moderator is telling me that Trump is interrupting too much or that Trump is saying something wrong and they're pushing back on Trump, well, I should believe them.
Well, and it's interesting. The moderator, certainly this election cycle, but also in recent election cycles, presidential election cycles, the moderators have become such a topic of controversy. In a way, there's almost more attention on the moderator than on the candidates. And yet, here in the United States, we have this long tradition of political debates, including the most famous debates in all of American history, and in a way, arguably, all of human history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates back in 1858. And that model kind of solves the problem of the moderator, because the moderator had very little, really it was just a timer. That was it. There were rules. They each knew how long they had to speak, and it was a much longer format. It would be interesting to see both candidates, modern candidates, but also modern citizens experience something like the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The format, for those who don't remember, there were 7 debates.
Right.
This was in the fall of 1858. Stephen Douglas was the incumbent. He was in the United States Senate. His 6-year term was finishing out, and he was running for re-election.
Right. Let's remind people, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were not presidential debates.
Correct.
Lincoln-Douglas debates were for the Senate in
Seat in the Senate.
1858 in Illinois.
And that adds a very strange dimension to those debates because at that time, citizens did not vote directly for senators, for U.S. senators.
Right.
They were selected by the state legislature. So it was really the Illinois state legislature was going to choose who to send to the Senate. So it was a peculiar thing to have these two candidates for the U.S. Senate debating in public in front of ordinary citizens. Douglas was a Democrat, lifelong Democrat. At that time, the Republican Party was newly formed. It was only 4 years old, had been formed in 1854. And the Republican Party of Illinois had nominated Abraham Lincoln to be the candidate, the nominee. Mm-hmm. And they agreed to a series of 7 debates. The backstory of this is quite funny. At that time, Stephen Douglas was the biggest political celebrity in the country. And when I say political celebrity, that really means the biggest celebrity, period, because there was no Hollywood. Right. There were no professional sports. What we call popular culture today didn't really exist. Politics was the popular culture. And more people knew about Stephen Douglas than knew about the President of the United States at that time. Lincoln was relatively unknown. He had served 1 term in the U.S. House for 2 years. And remember, Congress back then, a session was only a couple of months long. And he was undistinguished for that. He was a practicing lawyer, had a bunch of debt to pay off. I mean, he just wasn't a very well-known guy. And so the way he could get an audience is he would follow Douglas around. When Stephen Douglas would give a speech, 10,000 people would show up at a county fair, things like that. And then Lincoln would show up at the back of the audience. Right. When Douglas was done speaking, he'd wave his big, long, gangly arms, and he'd say, hey, if you want to hear why Douglas is full of hot air, come listen to me. And so the crowd would turn around and they would listen to Lincoln. So when Lincoln proposed a series of debates, Douglas easily could have just ignored him, just told him to go jump in a lake. Instead, Douglas was so irritated by Lincoln, he agreed to it on the condition. He said, all right, I will meet you for these scheduled debates if you stop following me around, stop giving speeches to my audiences. So they have these 7 debates in the fall of 1858. The first speaker had 1 hour to say whatever he wanted. No parameters, no limit, whatever you want to say for that hour. Speak for an hour. And then the second one had an hour and a half rebuttal. And then the first speaker, the first candidate, got a 30-minute period right at the end. So it was a total of 3 hours. And what they did is they alternated who started. Douglas started the first one, so since there were 7, he actually got to open in 4 of the debates. Lincoln only opened in 3. But here's the thing. When the rules say you're the opening speaker, you get an hour. Get up there and talk about whatever you want to talk about. And then we'll tell you when your time is over. You sit down. And then the second candidate gets up. He has an hour and a half to give his own message and to respond to whatever the first speaker said. It removes the influence of the moderator. There's not much that a moderator can do to skew that kind of in-depth, lengthy, serious debate. I wonder, are citizens today, do they have the attention span to pay attention to that kind of in-depth discussion? I don't know. And how about the candidates? What if Joe Biden had an hour and a half?
Well, we know Trump can talk for as long as you'll let him, right? We've seen it at the and as you're talking about these county fair opportunities, I'm picturing what would happen if Joe Biden showed up at a Trump rally and has said,
"Listen to me,"
had a big megaphone or a big speaker system. Yeah. Hey, all right, everybody, turn around and listen to me. How would the crowd react? And that crowd reaction, though, is almost what would get in the way of us formatting debates the same way the Lincoln Douglas debates would be. I probably have the attention span to listen to some of that if it was interesting, if it was good, if it was thoughtful, if it was principled. But I got to tell you, if you expect me to sit there and listen to Joe Biden talk for an hour and a half, I'm changing the channel. I'm setting the timer, and I'm going and I'm watching something different.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd have the patience not to sit and just listen, but it's not about just sitting and listening. It's about actually
being
sitting
engaged
there and listening to some of the things that are coming out of his mouth. Look, we talked about in the last podcast why it's so hard for progressives and non-progressives to get along and be civil. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I could be civil and sit there. It's like watching your least favorite football team.
Yeah.
I'm going to want a foam brick to throw at the television.
It's interesting. This is a little off topic, but it's related. I took a course in college as an undergraduate student. It was in the communications department. And the truth is, I took it because it just sounded like a fluff course, and it turned out to be fascinating. The course title was Listening.
Okay.
It was a semester-long undergraduate course in the on listening. And one of the big takeaways was the difference between listening versus hearing, right? To hear something doesn't mean you really have to pay attention at all. You can hear noises in the background and not pay attention. But listening it takes some conscious effort. It's work, right? To pay attention and to be thinking through, reflecting on what you are listening to. And that's what those kinds of serious, in-depth debates require. Here's another interesting facet.
Before you move on to that.
Yeah.
Listening not only by us, but the candidates have to be listening to each other.
Yes.
And what we've witnessed, and this isn't even just Trump and Biden, it's not just Pence and Kamala Harris. We've been seeing this in debates for years, for decades, is candidates talking past each other, right? I don't really care what you just said. I want to say something. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. I wasn't even listening to you. I was making notes about my next comment.
Yep.
And the moderators have to listen too.
Yeah, that's right.
And there is so much that goes on that the moderators sit there and think, okay, we have a structure of this debate. I'm going to stick to the structure. I don't care what I heard. I don't care what they just said. I am moving on. And no matter how important or how beneficial a further conversation might be to the American public, I'm not really listening to you. I'm going to push back if you say something that just jumps into my head and I can't believe you just said that. I'm going to push back.
Well, in fact, there's a whole training for that. And these people who grow up in the political ranks and they get elected to high office, which means they spend time on, being interviewed and those sorts of things. There is intensive professional training where they learn how we see this all the time on news talk shows. So a broadcaster will research a certain topic and will craft a question. And it might be a perfectly legitimate, serious, right, important question. And so the interviewer will lay out some basic facts and scenarios and then pose this question. And then the interviewee says, that's a really interesting question, but I'm here today to talk about, right, and completely switches it to this unrelated topic and just takes off in a different direction. And that happens all the time, and those people are trained to do that.
And presumably we can expect that Thursday night.
Right.
Trump has already come out with a statement saying he is not happy that foreign policy is not a part of this debate. He thinks foreign policy
what
with
that
China
means is he'll just end up talking about it.
And he's going to bring it up, regardless of whether or not the moderator wants it to be a topic. Regardless, he is going to say to Joe Biden, look at all the things that have come out about your son.
Well, and here's another interesting facet to these debates, modern and older, 170 years ago. When Lincoln and Douglas were debating, the federal government was relatively small, certainly way, way smaller than it is today. We didn't have all these regulatory agencies. We didn't have all these entitlement programs, subsidy programs. We weren't sending money all over the world. None of that was going on.
They were still angry at King George for doing it to them.
That's right. And so here's the point. The federal government as a whole, as an institution, was focused on a very few things. At that moment, the number one burning topic was, should slavery be allowed to spread out into the federal territory or not? And then they went after all these dimensions, right? What does that mean morally? Should we, morally, is that right to let slavery spread? Constitutionally, does Congress have constitutional power out there? And there are all these different dimensions to this one topic. And people had the attention span to listen to thoughtful minds dig into a subject from different angles, talking about different aspects. Today, our situation is totally different. We have a government that is now involved in, well, basically everything.
Yep.
There's hardly an area of life that government is not subsidizing or regulating or doing both. And so there are many more topics that can be discussed, and yet the discussions haven't gotten bigger. They haven't gotten more in-depth. They're now, often these candidates get 90 seconds, 30 seconds, right, to address some subject, and the attention span of citizens has gotten shorter and shorter along with it.
I think that's part of it. I think part of it is there's not a whole lot to say, right? Joe Biden or Donald Trump, for that matter, can't get up there and talk about, okay, let's talk about oil and coal and natural gas and nuclear power and energy as a whole.
Right.
They're not going to get up for an hour and talk about that topic. How much is there to say? Donald Trump says, I don't want to put coal plants out of commission. I want to expand America's energy independence. That's my government plan for this. Joe Biden says, I'm going to end fracking. No, I'm not going to end fracking. Yes, I am going to end fracking. No, I'm not. Now I think it's all becoming pretty clear that Joe Biden's actually, his purpose here is not to make fracking illegal. That's how he can say, I'm not going to end fracking.
Right.
He's just going to regulate it out.
Right.
He's going to create so many regulations that make it so difficult to frack that you can't do it anymore, regardless of whether or not he says you can frack or not.
Right.
He's not going to make a law saying no fracking. He's going to make so many regulations.
Make it so expensive. Make it cost prohibitive.
Right. Yeah. Right. But we know his plan. He's going to move to a Green New Deal model, whatever he wants to call it. Mm-hmm. But his website says it's based on the Green New Deal.
Right.
There's not a whole lot of substance there on either side, because they're just saying, here's the government's plan. We're going to take care of this for you. You as citizens, you don't have a whole lot of responsibility here. Either I'm going to keep you working or I'm going to make you switch jobs, and that's really the discussion. That would be the entire conversation.
Well, in fact, we've written a piece that we're shopping around right now, and in the piece we point out the theme of the essay is progressivism. It's the progressivism as the great problem facing the future of freedom in the United States. And we point out that in certain respects, Joe Biden is a model progressive. And we actually say that respectfully. We're not making fun of it. We're pointing out he genuinely believes, when he's asked questions, very often his response is some form of, I'll do what the experts say should be done.
Or even take it a step further. I will make a government program to do what the experts say should be done.
Right. And it raises, and this is very relevant here to this whole theme of debating, it raises a question of, in a world of progressivism, why have elected branches at all? Why have an elected president? In a way, even more interesting, why have an elected Congress? Because the whole purpose of Congress is the branch that has the legislative power. That is the power to make law. And law is binding, right? Law is, you can't, if you violate it, you're in trouble with the government. They're going to come after you with guns and maybe put you in jail if you violate the laws. It's a tremendous power, the power to pass law. And so that legislative branch was designed with a very specific purpose. The purpose was deliberation. They wanted to encourage deliberation in the process of passing laws, so that laws were the result of serious, thoughtful, right, principled, multifaceted deliberation, where we have different people representing different constituencies, different interest groups, all chiming in and having a serious, thoughtful discussion, deliberation, debate. That concept that we, the American people, should govern ourselves through elected representatives who deliberate and debate really is incompatible with the progressive model of defer to the experts. Right? They're doing their research. They have their latest data, which might change, but as of today, here's the data, and they say, therefore you shall do X, Y, or Z. There's the rule. If we're going to defer to experts tend to know much about one thing.
Right.
The thing they research, they often know much. What they're not good at, what scientists are not good at, is, well, a couple of things. First of all, they're not good at knowing what I value, what my priorities are, or what yours are, or millions of others. There's no way, there's no research in the world that can tell them, do they know, is my fear of getting COVID more valuable to me, or is my desire to interact with some friends and family more important to me?
Or to keep my business operating, or to...
Exactly.
Right.
They don't know, and the truth is it changes from person. Different people have different priorities. They value things in different ways. The other thing that experts tend not to be good at is taking a variety of competing goods, recognizing, well, they're all valuable to different degrees to different people, and making judgment. If we have more of this, then we got to give up some of it. Right? If more security against getting COVID means less socializing with other people, less business opportunities. Right? There are these trade-offs. They're not good at that. What they're good at saying is, well, we did this data, and the data says you should stay home so you don't get COVID, period.
Also known as unintended consequences.
That's right.
And I think back to all of the different examples you could look at in that. And I think that they're important to point some of those out. I mean, when we talk about, it reminds me of all the sports movies that have always come out, that there's always somebody who gets hurt and the doctor comes over and says, you're done. You can't play anymore, right? And the player always says, heck with that. I got to play. We got to win.
And the Karate Kid says, Mr. Miyagi, will you do your rub, right? And heal my leg enough so that I can go out there because his priority at that moment is finishing the tournament.
And the doctor's response is, what do I know? I'm just a doctor, right? But as the doctor, his only focus is on the health aspect. Right. They don't understand what the winning means to the person, or the participation, or the completing a task. There's just so many applications. You think about a cop. I think there are certain circumstances where a cop would say, you know what? Yeah, for the next 24 hours, I would be much happier if everybody just stayed in their house and didn't leave, because it would make my life a whole lot easier. We would have less shootings in the streets. We would have less this and that. It's not up to them to say what everybody's priorities are and what the sacrifices that will result from that, and what are the unintended consequences that happen inside of the house and everything else. And it's really difficult. So I think we have gotten a little bit off of the debate train, and I'd like to go back and spend a little bit more time talking about what we as citizens used to expect, what we expect today. And kind of emphasize the point here that this is not on the candidates. The candidates do their research. I know we already said this, but it's important to echo. The candidates do their research. The candidates understand that we as Americans largely want them to tell us how to solve these problems. They want us to have them tell us, here's how to handle COVID. Here's how to handle foreign violence. Here's how to handle domestic violence. Here's how to handle this, that, and the other.
Right.
They know we're not looking for them to have a debate about the Constitution.
I went back and I like to read things more than listen.
Right.
So very often I don't watch political speeches or debates. I prefer the next day to read the transcript if it's possible. So I went and I looked at for the very first debate between Trump and Biden. I pulled up the transcript and I just did a quick search for the word Constitution. The Constitution was mentioned one time at the very beginning by Chris Wallace, the moderator, talking about the idea that, I think this was before Trump had nominated Amy Coney Barrett, but the idea of originalist judges, right, on the Supreme Court who would uphold the Constitution. The candidates, neither of them, ever said anything about the Constitution. And to your point, there's a reason they don't talk about the Constitution, because they have no reason to think that there are large numbers of citizens who want to hear discussions about the Constitution. So they don't talk about it. When you have a body politic, when you have large numbers of citizens, when you have a a civic culture that is a constitutional culture, meaning the Constitution is alive and relevant and in the minds of citizens, well, then you get politicians talking about constitutional subjects. And that doesn't mean they all agree. They actually might have some really important, serious disagreements on the Constitution. When you look at American politics from the time of the founding, from the very first Congress, all the way, certainly through the Civil War, into the early progressive era, that's over a century. Our politics during that period tended to be heavily constitutional politics. Think of all the great controversies. In Washington's first administration, Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, is coming up with all these economic plans, which included a bank, creating a bank of right? And what was the big fight? Is that constitutional? There's no mention of a national bank in the Constitution. In the Adams administration, I mean, this is in the early years of the Republic, there was, this might surprise people, there was all this concern about foreign influence. They weren't Russians then, they were French. We have all these Frenchmen here, right? And so the Federalists in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts where they could actually punish people for saying critical things of the federal government. And the big question there was, is that constitutional or not? Jefferson runs on this campaign of those laws are unconstitutional and we're going to restore the authority of the Constitution. Later they have big fights over tariffs. Are these high tariffs constitutional? I mentioned earlier the fights over slavery spreading out into the territory. What power does the Constitution give to Congress out in the territory? All these were framed, these political disputes were framed in constitutional terms, which meant citizens were thinking about their Constitution. Their politicians, the candidates they were supporting, talked about the Constitution. And one of the terrible effects of progressivism, of this progressive era that we're in and has been going on for 150 years, is progressivism belittles and dismisses the Constitution. The Constitution becomes increasingly irrelevant. And so, as a little test, on Thursday evening during the debate, I want our listeners to listen carefully if there's any discussion of constitutionalism,
right?
Whether any policy or idea is constitutional or unconstitutional, and why.
This is just a personal belief, guess. I don't have a whole lot of evidence to support this, but I think there's a lot of things that Trump does where he would rather just say COVID is the perfect example, right? Trump has done what I believe is a very good job understanding the role of the federal government versus the role of the states when it comes to taking care of COVID.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think Trump would love to just come out and say, Joe, you're telling me I failed at COVID. COVID's not my responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the federal government. Read your Constitution. Right. Understand what the role of the presidency is. You're running for this job, and you're wanting the president to do something that is not the job of the president.
Right.
But he also understands that that's not a winning argument among most Americans.
I want to be clear. It's a true argument.
Right.
It's actually true. It's just not popular.
I actually have a question for you as more of the historian in this, that something I haven't thought about. But how much of this can be traced back to the 17th Amendment, to the idea here of how little the Electoral College actually debates anymore, right? That the Electoral College is largely just tied to the way the states vote. There was a time when the president and senators were being elected by people who were in government and who were, therefore, you could presume knew a little bit more about the Constitution than your average citizen, right? So the candidates were making these speeches, even back to Lincoln and Douglas, but coming all the way up to Kennedy and Nixon and all the way through today. You were making these cases for the American public back during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but at the same time, to an extent, you were talking to the electors, right?
Yes.
They were talking to the state legislature, even though they wanted the American public to hear the debates at the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Yes, you are correct. And it also, those candidates tended to put a fairly heavy burden on the citizens, because in the case of Lincoln Douglas, for example, the ultimate takeaway was either one that you like, you as a citizen, you don't get to vote for them. So you got to figure out who should you be voting for to go be in the state legislature, right? If you like Douglas, you got to make sure that your Democratic partisan state legislator candidate gets elected,
right,
so that they will then select Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate. I mean, maybe for politicos that's not terribly complicated, but that's not the way most citizens, right, tend to think about these things. Oh, I got to make sure that this slate of candidates gets elected to the state legislature so that I can get the U.S. senator that I want.
Well, you say that, but what was one of the biggest reasons many people voted for Trump in 2016? They knew he was going to get to appoint judges.
Right.
And he knew how many empty seats on the federal court there were.
Right.
We knew how many Supreme Court seats might be coming up. I don't think any of us assumed or imagined 3 seats would be changed.
And by the way, here I got to give him credit. I don't know that I give Trump credit enough. Our members at the Vino Veritas Society, is probably no surprise that I'm not a great fan of the Supreme Court. These lawyers who sit on the court have done so much damage to the cause of constitutional government. But I will say that Trump has done, I think, as good a job as possible in finding people. I mean, you never know how these people are going to end up ruling once they get to be on the Supreme. I mean, who knew that Republican John Roberts would have Obamacare in front of him not once but twice and could find no constitutional problems with it at all? But in terms of a president trying to select the best originalist that he can find, boy, he's really done a good job. I mean, he's really put up some really impressive. The two who stand out in my mind, Neil Gorsuch is a very thoughtful, serious, devoted student of the Constitution, and the most recent nominee. I mean, I am on social media. I have a large network of progressives and Democrats, and I pay attention to them. In a way, I'm more interested in what they're talking about than conservatives, and even these lefty progressive Democrats, all of them were saying, she deserves to be on the Supreme Court.
I'm getting the same.
I'm going to disagree with everything. I'm cringing knowing how she's going to rule, but this is a really impressive mind. This is an impressive person. She should be on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So kudos to Trump for actually selecting the kind of judges he said he was going to try to select.
Sure. So going back to that question, and I might have answered it. It seems to me, I don't know how committed or how well-versed is the better word, how well-versed in constitutionalism the average citizen ever was in this country. I don't know that in 1800, when Adams and Jefferson were running against each other, how well-versed the average citizen was in the terms of the Constitution, understanding what was written in the Declaration.
Right.
Obviously, schooling was very different then. A lot of it was this great classical education, but a lot of it was self-taught too, right?
Yep.
You think about guys like Ben Franklin, who really didn't go to school into his teens.
Right.
But when they talked about, when the candidates talked about the Constitution, they were talking to a political class. They were talking to members of the legislature or future members of the legislature. They were talking to potential members of the Electoral College who were being elected or put in those positions because of their ability to debate and negotiate and understand those terms. I wonder if we really looked back how much that has changed, that conversation has changed away from the Constitution, how much progressivism has taken hold because we're not talking to that group of people anymore, but we're talking to a general electorate who isn't necessarily as familiar with the Constitution. And obviously, education in and of itself, as progressives took hold of the education system, taught it less and less.
Well, you're pointing to a big subject that it's unpopular in our modern progressive world, and yet it's important to know the truth. The truth is that the Constitution was designed with a view, two basic ideas that kind of are antagonistic toward each other. There's a tension, to use a term scholars in the world of political philosophy, there's a tension between these two things. And here are the two things. One is, on the one hand, any legitimate government, to be legitimate, absolutely requires the consent of the governed.
Sure.
You have to have that. And the people very often make really bad choices, really irrational, stupid choices. So somehow you got to work this out. You need the people to give a basic kind of authorization to their government, but you don't want the people too directly involved in many of the decisions that government's making. And so we get this fascinating, unprecedented kind of constitution where, first of all, you have a legislative chamber that has two separate branches, one of which is directly elected by the people, the House, but a Senate that is not directly elected. They're elected by state legislatures. Right. Then you have a president who's selected by an electoral college. And that whole idea of the college was in each state there would be a handful of people, literally 8, 10, 12, 20 people, enough who could fit in this room and deliberating with each other. Who do they think is the best person to be president? And then a judicial branch that's not elected at all, and for the most part serves life tenures. And so that meant there were different constituent groups. For example, state legislators were a constituent group for U.S. senators. That was their constituency. Mm-hmm. That's who they were accountable to. And in the case of the president, right, it's these electors in the Electoral College. There was not all politics, therefore, was an appeal to the masses. Not all politics was an appeal to the entire United States population. One of the things we get with the progressive innovation, the progressive revolution, really, in American politics is this notion that what government should do is satisfy the will of the people. And so there's a need to speak directly to the people, see what the people want and demand, and then go hire the experts and the bureaucrats to figure out how to accomplish the goal of whatever it is that the people want and demand. And that does change the character of our politics. I'll add to this for the more theoretical minded among our listeners. Alexis de Tocqueville is maybe one of the best minds who anticipated this. He was very prescient in his predictions. And he saw this coming, that when his most famous book is titled Democracy in America.
Sure.
And when he says democracy, he means, do we have?
No, we don't. It's on my bookshelf at home.
When he says democracy.
Oh, yes, it's right here.
There it is, yeah. He means more than simply one way of conducting elections or one way of running a government. He means democracy is kind of a transformative cultural effect. Harvey Mansfield, one of the great teachers of Tocqueville, always liked to say in class, democracy democratizes. It turns everything into a popularity contest among the masses. Mm-hmm. And so within a democracy over time, what becomes prominent is whatever's popular among the many. And things that are only popular among the elite, among the few, tend to go away. They tend not to survive in a democracy. And there's a lot of truth to that. So, so a debate, a political debate between two or more candidates that is for a very select audience. Imagine a debate being conducted for a state legislature. Mm-hmm. That would be, right, there would be certain features to that kind of debate versus the same two candidates debating each other for just a mass popular audience. You're going to make a lot more, unfounded, ungrounded, unprincipled appeals to the masses because you can get away with it in a way that you might not be able to get away with a smaller, more selective, more sophisticated audience.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of truth to that. As our politics has become increasingly based on the opinions and the votes of the many, it changes the way that politicians present their cases. That's just in an abstract. Then you look at the concrete cultural transformation here in the United States. Citizens have gone from they're less independent, less self-reliant, less self-assertive. Increasingly, they're becoming more progressive, meaning they're more dependent on others. They want to be told by others what to do and how to run their business, how to raise their kids, those sort of things. So as the American people have become more progressive, basically, I mean, this is my shorthand version of it. What they want from those in government is a combination of Santa Claus and Big Daddy. right? They want someone who's going to provide stuff. Here's all the stuff you want. You want health care? Here's your free health care. And some version of Big Daddy, or someone who's going to protect you from all the scary things in the world, including viruses.
Right. So I think the message that comes out of all of this goes to the idea of, as people who love freedom, as people who, if you're somebody who loves freedom, who loves the American idea, who loves the founding of this country, who respects, at the very least, I'm not even going to go to the point of totally understanding,
right,
but respects the purpose, the mission, the goals of the founding of this country. Mm-hmm. If you're one of those people, it's time we, as a group, start going through a fundamental shift.
Yes.
Our expectations have to. If the candidates are no longer talking to a political class, a smaller group of people who are constitutionally aware, then we must become that group ourselves.
You're absolutely. I'm going to put this in just a little different framework as an exercise of the imagination. I want the listener right now to imagine, as the Vino Veritas Society grows and our chapters start to number in the hundreds and then the thousands, and the ranks of our members grows into the hundreds of thousands and then millions, and we become a culture-shaping force in America. And that will mean growing numbers of Americans will become increasingly independent in their own personal lives, independent, self-reliant, productive. They will become increasingly self-assertive, going to stand up and tell fellow citizens, and especially those in government, stop doing stuff you're not supposed to do. Just imagine, as growing numbers of citizens are feisty, spirited, independent, free, self-reliant, and then you get political candidates stand there saying, I think education should be this, and I think healthcare should be that, and I think we need these affirmative action. Those kinds of feisty, spirited citizens will say, what the hell are you talking about? We're going to raise our kids the way we want to raise our kids. That's not your job to decide what's in our kids' classroom. And our health care, that's between my physician and I. Get out of our... Feisty, spirited citizens will shut that down, and there will be no market for it. And the result will be more constitutionally oriented politicians.
And that politician, that's the opportunity for Trump to say, or somebody like Trump to say, Joe, you're sitting here talking to me like I should care that you think I did a bad job with COVID.
Right.
That's not my job.
Right.
Stop. And all of these people who are watching on TV right now, they know that too, Joe.
Right.
They know that too, Joe. They don't want you controlling their lives. They don't want you solving COVID for them. They want you to just stay out of the way and let them go consult with their doctor and make the best decision for themselves, their family, their community that they can make, because they are a thoughtful, self-reliant people.
First time I heard about COVID, you know what I did?
Called your doctor.
I did. Well, I did not call the CDC.
Right.
I did not call the President of the United States. I sent a little email to my physician, and I asked her, what should I do about this? And she was preparing. She was going to send out an email blast to all of her clients, and so she said, well, I don't have it quite ready. So she gave me some of the basic things I needed to know about COVID. Here are the risks, right? Here are the ways to protect yourself. If that's important to you, make wise choices. And so I consulted with my physician about a possible threat to my health. That's what independent, spirited citizens do.
Right.
They don't depend on the federal government to address every single scary sounding thing in the world.
Right. And to that end, I think let's close on just continuing to remind people that if you want better debates, if you want debates about the Constitution, if you want debates like the Lincoln Douglas debates, if you want candidates who are going to talk with that substance, this isn't on them.
If you want better government,
right?
You want better government, it's not on them. It's on us.
The candidates are just responding to what their polling and their research is telling them we want.
Right.
If you want better, and this isn't even a critique of Trump. This is Trump is doing exactly what is demanded of him right now.
Right.
Trump is being the candidate he is demanding that they demand him to be. And like we talked about with COVID, I think there's been a lot of opportunities throughout his presidency where he's acted in the way the Constitution would like him to, but he can't publicly say, I'm leaving this to the states because it's not my job.
Right.
Because we, the people, have all of a sudden begun to think it's his job.
Right.
And so let's continue to defend and guard the ideas of the Constitution, guard the ideas of the Declaration, and be guardians of the American idea.
Nos somos custodes.
Let's keep this up until next time.
All righty.